There is a scene in Family Guy that nobody talks about. Not a cutaway gag, not a musical number, a quiet moment where a teenage girl looks at her family, says every true thing she has ever wanted to say, and then takes it all back. Not because she was wrong, because the family needed her to be the one they were allowed to hurt, and she loved them enough to keep letting them. That scene is the most honest 30 seconds the show ever produced, and it is surrounded by 25 years of bright colors and a laugh track and one of the most recognized theme songs in television history, all of it running over something the show was documenting the entire time without ever quite saying out loud. Family Guy is not a dark comedy with a funny family at the center. It never was. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Tonight we go through every major character in this show and look at what was actually there the whole time. Let us begin. Peter Griffin, the regression of America's dad. There is a moment in the early seasons of Family Guy where Peter Griffin stands in front of his family, having made a complete mess of something, and you can see in his face that he knows it. He looks embarrassed, slightly ashamed, like a man who went too far and is aware of the distance he needs to travel to get back. He doesn't always make it back, but he tries. And that trying is the thing that made him worth watching for the first chunk of the show's life. That version of Peter Griffin no longer exists. What replaced him is something the show never formally announced and never properly explained. A slow, grinding transformation from a lovable idiot into something a lot harder to defend. And the strangest part of that transformation is that it happened in plain sight across hundreds of episodes, while the laugh track kept running and the ratings stayed strong and millions of people kept watching without anyone stopping to ask what exactly they were laughing at anymore. Peter Griffin started as a character with a direct ancestor. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, had made 2 short films before the show existed, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. Larry was the centerpiece, a big, dim, well-meaning middle-aged man with a talking dog. When Fox asked MacFarlane to pitch a full series, Larry became Peter, Steve became Brian, and the basic template stayed the same. Peter was going to be the bumbling dad at the center of a family that somehow kept surviving his mistakes. That was the idea. That was the foundation. And for a while, it worked. In the early seasons, Peter was stupid in the way that can be genuinely funny. Not because stupidity is amusing on its own, but because the show balanced it with something real underneath. He loved Lois in a way that felt earned. He embarrassed his kids, but also, occasionally, came through for them. When he caused a disaster, the episode usually made him face some version of what he had done wrong. He wasn't a good man, but he was a man, which is different from what he became later. Somewhere around season 8, that balance broke. What the show did to Peter after the post-cancellation revival solidified is one of the most well-documented cases of a character being slowly turned into something the original version of that character would not recognize. The fan and critic term for this is flanderization, when a single trait gets enlarged and enlarged until it swallows everything else the character was. Peter's lovable stupidity got bigger. His warmth got smaller. His cruelty, which used to be occasional and usually punished, became the engine of entire episodes. And the consequences, which used to show up eventually, mostly stopped showing up at all. To understand how far the shift went, you have to look at what Peter Griffin actually does across the documented run of the show. He has, in recorded episodes, sold his daughter Meg to pay off a debt. He has asked God directly to remove Meg from existence. He has thrown her from a boat. He has farted in her face. Not once as a throwaway gag, but as a repeated bit revisited across multiple episodes in different seasons. He left his wife Lois to what he believed was a shark attack. He hid his infant son Stewie, who had infected head wounds, underneath a car while Lois was backing out because he didn't want to explain how Stewie got hurt. He tried to marry his own son Chris for inheritance money. He has caused the deaths of people in Quahog through his fights with the giant chicken, with wreckage and bodies left behind in the street, and the show moves on before any of that is addressed. In at least 2 episodes, the show implies Peter has child pornography on his laptop. In one, he throws the laptop into the ocean to prevent it from being discovered. These are not fan theories. These are things that happened in episodes that aired on television. The clinical reading of Peter, the one that turns up in psychology papers written about him as a fictional subject, is antisocial personality disorder, a pattern of behavior where someone repeatedly does harm to others, breaks rules and social agreements, feels little to no guilt about it, and faces consequences either very rarely or not at all. The show even gave Peter an IQ test in an episode that placed him at 70, a number that, in the real world, suggests a significant intellectual disability. The show used this to get Peter declared legally mentally challenged, then played the aftermath for jokes. But that number stayed on the record. It's in the episode. It's part of the canon. What makes the Peter story disturbing is not any single terrible thing he does. Animated shows do terrible things constantly. The thing that makes it disturbing is the pattern underneath the terrible things, specifically the disappearance of the part of the show that used to respond to them. In seasons 1 through 7, Family Guy had a kind of moral gravity. It was loose, frequently broken, often absurd, but it was there. When Peter did something genuinely bad, something came back at him. Not always fair, not always proportional, but something. The show believed, at least occasionally, that actions had weight. That belief is what allowed the audience to keep liking Peter, despite everything he did. Because liking someone who faces no consequences for anything is a different relationship than liking someone who messes up and feels it. After season 8, the consequences largely went away. Peter became what critics and longtime viewers started calling a karma-proof character. Someone who could do almost anything and walk away untouched. He didn't grow, he didn't change, he didn't suffer in ways that connected back to what he had done. He just moved on to the next episode, and the next disaster, and the next person he would hurt before the credits rolled. This matters because of what it teaches. Family Guy ran through a period of its highest viewership during exactly the stretch where Peter was at his worst. Children who were watching the show in the late 2000s and into the 2010s were watching a man behave with spectacular cruelty toward his family, his daughter especially, and seeing no real cost attached to that cruelty. They were watching a show that had quietly stopped believing its main character needed to be held accountable for anything, and they were absorbing that along with the jokes. There's a specific episode worth naming here. In the Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, Peter shoves Meg's face into his rear and farts on her. The show plays it entirely for laughs. No one intervenes. No consequence follows. The episode moves on. That gag was then revisited, not once but multiple times across subsequent seasons, with variations. The writers returned to it. They thought it was worth coming back to, and the audience laughed because the laugh track told them to, and because by that point, the show had trained its viewers to understand that Meg getting hurt was always the punchline and never the problem. The person Peter Griffin was in season 1 would not have done that to his daughter. That is not an interpretation. You can watch the early episodes and see the difference. Early Peter embarrasses Meg in ways a clueless, self-centered father might embarrass a daughter. Late Peter targets her with something that doesn't read like cluelessness anymore. The show stopped explaining the difference because the show stopped caring about the difference. There is one more thing worth saying about Peter Griffin, and it's the most uncomfortable thing. He has a backstory. It's not talked about constantly, but it's there in the episodes that bother to remember it. His father Francis was cold, distant, and harsh. Peter was bullied in school. He was, in multiple referenced episodes, molested. He grew up without the tools to process what had happened to him, without a model for how to be a father that wasn't either absent or cruel. The show gives him this history and then mostly ignores it, but it's part of the record. This matters because it makes Peter something more complicated than just a bad character who got worse. It makes him a portrait of a specific kind of damage, the kind that gets passed down when no one stops the chain. Peter treats his children the way broken adults sometimes treat children. Not from pure malice, but from a total lack of the emotional tools that would let him do anything differently. He doesn't know how to be a good father because he never had one. He doesn't know how to take care of his children because no one modeled that for him. And the show knows this and chose, somewhere around season 8, to stop using it as a lens for understanding Peter and start using it as background noise. That choice, to take a character with a comprehensible, even sympathetic psychological origin and strip the comprehension away until only the cruelty remained, is what the story of Peter Griffin is actually about. Not the fart jokes, not the giant chicken fights. The story is about a show that looked at its main character, decided he was funnier when nothing meant anything, and stopped asking what the audience was actually being taught by watching him get away with everything. The version of Peter Griffin who tried, who loved Lois even when he was too stupid to show it right, who occasionally showed up for his kids even when it cost him. That version died somewhere in the middle of the show's run, quietly and without ceremony. What the show put in his place kept his face and his voice and his name, and kept getting renewed, and kept generating merchandise, and kept making people laugh. And the laugh track kept running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is something underneath the surface of this show that goes beyond one character getting worse over time. The Peter story is really a setup for a much larger question, one that the next character makes almost impossible to avoid. Because if Peter is the rot at the center of the Griffin family, then the character sleeping in his house and watching it all happen from the closest possible distance has a completely different kind of problem, one the show has been confessing to for 20 years without ever quite saying it out loud. Section 2. Meg Griffin, the show's most honest confession. There is an episode of Family Guy where Meg Griffin finally breaks. Not in a funny way. Not in the way the show usually breaks Meg, which involves humiliation or rejection, or her father doing something awful to her while the music plays and the scene moves on. This is different. In season 10, episode 2, titled Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg sits down with her family and says everything she has never been allowed to say. She tells Peter he is a terrible father. She tells Lois she is a coward for watching it happen and doing nothing. She tells Chris he is weak for going along with it. She names every single thing that has been done to her, clearly and without flinching, and for a moment, the show holds still. And then the Griffin family falls apart. Without Meg as the shared target, without the one person everyone is allowed to dump their anger onto, the family turns on each other. Peter and Lois fight. Chris crumbles. The house becomes chaos. The family cannot function. And Meg, watching all of this, reaches a conclusion that the episode states out loud and means completely seriously. She is the lightning rod. She is the one person in the family who absorbs all the pain, all the frustration, all the ugly feelings that would otherwise destroy the people around her. She keeps the family together by being the one they are all allowed to hurt. And then she apologizes. She takes it all back. She tells them she lied, and she goes back to being what she was before. The show wrote that episode. The writers sat in a room and built that story and put it on television, which means at some point, someone in that room understood exactly what the show had been doing to Meg Griffin for a decade. And instead of stopping it, they made an episode that explained it, named it as emotional abuse, and then put it back. That is the most honest and the most disturbing thing Family Guy ever did. Meg Griffin was not always the family punching bag. In the earliest episodes, before the show settled into its rhythms, she was written closer to a normal teenager, awkward, self-conscious, trying to fit in at school, occasionally embarrassed by her family. The reviews from that first season describe her as the voice of reason in the house, something like what Lisa Simpson is to The Simpsons. She was the one who noticed when things were wrong. She was the one who pushed back in ways that made sense. That version of Meg lasted maybe a season. What happened next has been confirmed publicly by Seth MacFarlane himself. The writing staff in those early years was almost entirely male. They had no idea how to write an adolescent girl in a way that felt true or funny to them. They could not find her comedic voice. They did not know how to give her storylines that worked. And so they took the path that required the least imagination. They made her the target. They decided that the easiest thing to do with a character they could not figure out was to have bad things happen to her, over and over, in ways that kept escalating, because escalation is always easier than actual character writing. The escalation is documented across the show's run in a way that is almost clinical in its progression. In seasons 1 through 3, the abuse is mostly verbal. People are mean to Meg. They ignore her. They exclude her. The jokes are about her being unpopular and socially awkward, the generic cruelty of high school made into recurring gags. It is not kind, but it is not extraordinary. You have seen versions of this character in other shows. By seasons 4 through 10, the physical cruelty arrives and grows. Peter shoves her face into his rear and farts on her. He throws things at her. He sells her to the Goldman family to settle a debt. He shoots at her. He once asked God, directly and sincerely, to remove Meg from existence. Lois, who is supposed to be the sane parent, watches most of this happen and does not intervene. The family stops pretending there is a reason for the cruelty. It becomes its own justification. Meg gets hurt because Meg getting hurt is what the show does. From season 11 onward, it goes further. In documented episodes, the family openly wishes for her death. There are episodes where they forget she exists entirely. There are episodes where she is used as a physical object. The joke is no longer that the family is cruel to Meg. The joke has become, what is the most extreme thing we can do to Meg this week? The writers found a formula and kept pulling on it to see how far it would stretch. What was happening to Meg in these episodes, if you remove the cartoon and the laugh track and look at the behavior plainly, is a portrait of sustained family abuse. She is hit. She is humiliated. She is excluded. She is told she is worthless and ugly and unwanted. She is denied basic dignity by the people who are supposed to love her. She has no safe person in the house. And the show frames all of this as comedy. Meg's response to the abuse, which the show documents across seasons, is exactly what happens to real people in that situation. She becomes desperate for any scrap of affection. She falls obsessively in love with anyone who shows her the smallest kindness. A prisoner named Luke, the family's neighbor Joe Swanson, the family dog Brian. She shows suicidal tendencies in multiple episodes. This is not a throwaway detail. The show puts it on screen. A teenage girl who is being destroyed by her family is showing signs that she wants to stop existing, and the show treats this as background color. The show also documents what abuse does to someone's sense of self over time. In Dial Meg for Murder, after Meg gets out of prison, she comes home violent and dangerous and in control. She takes Peter's place in the household. She dominates everyone. She is terrifying. And for one episode, she is also powerful in a way she has never been allowed to be. The show treats this as comedy too. The joke being that Meg with a backbone is funny because Meg having a backbone is not the natural order. The natural order, the show keeps insisting, is Meg on the bottom. There is a theory that has circulated among Family Guy fans for years, and it is worth naming because it is grounded in canon. Multiple episodes imply that Peter Griffin is not Meg's biological father. A character named Stan Thompson is referenced in at least one episode as her possible real father. The theory holds that Peter's cruelty toward Meg, which exceeds what he does to his other children in both frequency and intensity, is at least partly rooted in the belief, conscious or not, that she is not his. The show has never confirmed this as permanent fact, but it has also never fully closed the door on it. It plants the seed and walks away. And if true, it makes Peter's behavior toward Meg not just cruelty for comedy's sake, but something with a specific and uglier motivation underneath. What the Seahorse Seashell Party episode revealed, and what makes it unlike almost anything else the show ever did, is that Family Guy was aware of the mechanism it had built. The writers knew that Meg's role was to absorb the family's pain. They knew it was not funny in any traditional sense. They knew it was abuse. They wrote an episode that said all of this explicitly, on screen, in Meg's own voice, and then they reversed it. They had Meg decide that absorbing the abuse is her job, her purpose, the thing she does to hold the family together. They made her choose it. That choice, making Meg the one who accepts her own destruction as necessary, is the most revealing moment in the show's history. It tells you that the writers understood what they were doing and kept doing it anyway. It tells you that the show had looked at a teenage girl being systematically broken by her family, found the mechanism that explained it, and decided that the mechanism was too useful to stop. Meg being the lightning rod was more valuable to the show than Meg being a person. The real-world context around this makes it harder to dismiss as just dark comedy. Seth MacFarlane has confirmed that the abuse increased specifically because male writers could not relate to a teenage girl. That is a real thing that a real creator said about a real character. The people responsible for Meg could not figure out how to write her as a human being, so they wrote her as a target. And then the show ran for 20 more seasons on the back of that decision, and Meg kept getting hurt, and the audience kept laughing, and the laugh track kept telling everyone that what they were watching was funny. By season 22, the abuse stopped. Women had joined the writing staff. The cruelty toward Meg quietly faded from the show's vocabulary. She began to be treated as a member of the family instead of the family's designated victim. This happened not because the show grew a conscience on its own, but because the people writing the show changed. The correlation is exact and confirmed. When the writers were all men who could not relate to Meg, she got hurt. When women joined the room, she stopped getting hurt. That fact contains more information about what the Meg story was always really about than any single episode does. There is one more piece of this that needs to be said before moving forward, and it is the piece the show is least comfortable with. Meg Griffin is, across the documented run of Family Guy, the kindest person in the Griffin house. She is more thoughtful than Peter. She is more emotionally honest than Lois. She is more considerate than Brian. She has genuine artistic talent that the show references and then ignores. She is not perfect, no one on the show is, but she is consistently the character whose first instinct is to care about other people. She is the one who notices when others are hurting. She is the one who tries, and she is the one who gets destroyed. Family Guy built a show where the cruelest, most self-serving characters face no consequences, and the kindest one absorbs punishment on behalf of everyone else. It then wrote an episode explaining that this is how the system works, and that the system requires it. And then it kept the system running for another decade. That is not an accident. That is a choice made deliberately, episode after episode, season after season, by people who understood what they were building. The open wound of Meg Griffin is what Family Guy looks like when you take the jokes away and look at what is underneath them. And what is underneath them is a show that found a teenage girl it could not figure out how to write, handed her to a room full of people who could not relate to her, and let them do whatever they wanted. What they wanted was to hurt her, and they did for 20 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next character in this house is the one who watched all of this happening and considered himself too smart and too self-aware to be part of the problem. He has a book he cannot finish, a son he never visits, and a glass of wine he will not put down. And the show built him specifically to be the person who understands everything except himself. Section 3. Brian Griffin. Seth MacFarlane infer. There is one fact about Brian Griffin that the show has never hidden, never walked back, and never tried to explain away. It is sitting right on the surface of every episode Brian has ever appeared in, available to anyone paying attention. Seth MacFarlane voices Brian in his own natural speaking voice, not a character voice, not a pitch shift, shift or an accent or a tone he puts on for the role. When McFarlane voices Peter, he goes nasally and high. When he voices Stewie, he goes British and sharp. When he voices Quagmire, he pulls from fast-talking radio announcers of the 1950s. But when he opens his mouth as Brian, nothing changes. That is McFarlane's actual voice, coming out of an animated white dog. McFarlane has confirmed this directly in interviews. He has also confirmed that Brian is his favorite character to play, that he feels most comfortable in that role, that Brian reflects his own political views, and that he has a picture of Brian next to his name on his office door. Brian Griffin is Seth MacFarlane, not metaphorically, by the creator's own admission. This matters enormously for understanding what the show is doing and what it accidentally revealed about itself over 20-plus seasons. Because Brian was designed as the idealized version of what MacFarlane saw himself as, sophisticated, literary, politically aware, a step above the chaos around him, the intellectual in a house full of idiots, the one who gets it. And what Family Guy then did, across hundreds of episodes, is systematically dismantle that self-image, piece by piece, until what was left was something the show's own characters called out by name. Brian started as the voice of reason. In the early seasons, he functioned as the one adult in the room, the character who could see what was happening around him clearly enough to comment on it, who read books and cared about ideas, and tried to be a decent person in a house where decency was not the default. He was funny in the way that smart, slightly tired people are funny. Dry, a little cynical, genuinely perceptive. You liked him because he seemed real in a way the other characters did not always manage. Then the show let him stay exactly like that. The same posture, the same self-image, the same belief that he was the reasonable one, while gradually revealing that everything underneath the posture was hollow. The book is the clearest example. Brian has been writing a novel for the entire run of the show. This is not a joke introduced and forgotten. It is a recurring piece of his character, referenced across seasons, built into who he believes himself to be. He is a writer. He is an intellectual. He has a novel that he is working on, that he has been working on, that represents the serious artistic ambition that separates him from everyone around him. He never finishes it. More than that, the show reveals that he is not actually a good writer. In Brian Writes a Bestseller, he publishes a book, but the book is not the novel. It is a cheap, self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The kind of shallow, motivational content that is the opposite of serious literary work. The book becomes a massive success. Brian responds to this success not with humility or self-awareness, but with immediate and total ego explosion. He becomes insufferable. He treats everyone around him badly. He appears on talk shows and acts like a celebrity. Stewie, who helped him get there, gets nothing. And when the success fades, Brian is left exactly where he started, with the unfinished novel and the self-image that the world has not properly recognized his genius. That cycle, Brian believing he deserves more than he has, getting a version of what he wants, handling it terribly, and returning to baseline, repeats throughout the show because it is the core of who Brian became. He is a person who has built his entire identity around being better than the people around him, and the evidence for that superiority keeps failing to materialize. His son is part of this story. Brian has a biological son named Dylan. Dylan appears in the show, and Brian's relationship with him is one of the clearest windows into what kind of person Brian actually is beneath the sophistication. He is an absent father. He does not show up. He is not present in Dylan's life in any consistent way. The show acknowledges this. It does not excuse it, and it is one of the things Quagmire lists in his famous takedown of Brian in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, where he tells Brian directly, "You failed college twice, you're a bad father, you're a drunk, and you are a bore." That speech is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the most unusual things a television show has ever done with its creator's self-insert character. Quagmire is not a good person. The show is not presenting him as a moral authority. But in that scene, everything he says about Brian is accurate and documented in episodes. Brian did fail college. Brian is absent from his son's life. Brian drinks heavily and consistently throughout the show. The martinis are as much a part of his character design as his white coat. And Quagmire's final charge, that Brian is just a boring, self-righteous drunk who lectures people while doing everything he lectures against, lands because the show has been building the case for it for years. MacFarlane wrote that speech. He voiced Brian receiving it. He sat in a recording booth and read the lines of a character destroying the idealized version of himself in his own voice and put it on television. That is either an extraordinary act of self-awareness or the most revealing accident in the show's history. The hypocrisy is documented in specific episodes, not just suggested as a general character trait. Brian is a committed atheist who, in Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, aggressively dismantles Meg's religious faith and makes her feel stupid for believing. This is a man who has met Jesus in the Family Guy universe, in episodes where divine figures literally appear. His atheism is not a philosophical position he has thought through carefully. It is a social posture, another way of being different from and better than the people around him. When it conflicts with evidence the show itself provides, he ignores the evidence. He preaches environmental responsibility while living a lifestyle that contradicts it. He lectures people about their choices while making the same choices. He positions himself as politically aware and morally superior while behaving, in documented episodes, with a selfishness that undermines every position he claims to hold. The alcoholism runs underneath all of it. Brian is drinking in almost every scene he appears in. The martini glass is as constant as his pretension. The show does not treat this as a crisis or a tragedy. It treats it as a character quirk, part of his sophisticated image, the kind of drinking that goes with reading books and listening to jazz. But the behavior the drinking produces, the bad decisions, the cruelty, the absence from his son's life, the endless failed relationships, is documented in the episodes, even if the show never quite connects the dots out loud. The worst thing Brian does in the entire run of the show is something that happens in the episode Switch the Flip. Brian switches bodies with Peter, and in Peter's body, he has sex with Lois. Lois does not know it is Brian. She believes she is with her husband. She has not agreed to be with Brian. She has not been told the truth. Brian knows all of this and proceeds anyway. This is sexual assault, committed by the show's most self-professedly moral character, against the woman he has claimed to love for the entire run of the series. The show does not treat this as a serious violation. It moves on. This is the character Seth MacFarlane called his favorite, the one he feels most comfortable playing, the one whose picture is on his office door. That information does not need to be stretched or exaggerated to be disturbing. It just needs to be held still and looked at. What the Brian story is really about, underneath the failed novel and the martinis and the Quagmire speech, is the gap between self-image and reality. Brian is a portrait of someone who has decided what kind of person he is, has built his entire sense of himself on that decision, and then behaves in ways that contradict it constantly, without ever updating the self-image to match. He thinks of himself as thoughtful, so he lectures people. He thinks of himself as talented, so he keeps writing a book he cannot finish. He thinks of himself as emotionally evolved, so he does not notice when he's being cruel. The self-image protects him from the reality, which is that he is an alcoholic with no meaningful accomplishments, an absent father, a hypocrite, and someone who assaulted a woman who trusted him. The show built this character as the version of its creator that the creator most wanted to be, and then the show spent 20 years proving that the version of himself the creator most wanted to be was not a good person. What makes this complicated is that the show also genuinely loves Brian. His death in the episode Life of Brian, where he is hit by a car and killed, produced one of the strongest audience responses in the show's history. Hundreds of thousands of people signed a petition to bring him back. MacFarlane later thanked fans for caring so much about the character. Brian was revived 2 episodes later, brought back through a time travel plot, and the show continued as if nothing had happened. The audience's attachment to Brian, despite everything documented above, is real. He connects with people. There is something in his longing to be more than he is, his failure to close the distance between who he thinks he is and who he actually is, that resonates in a way that outlasts the specific episodes where he behaves badly. That is probably because most people watching the show have felt that gap between self-image and reality at some point. Most people have believed they were more together than they actually were, more evolved, more capable of the life they imagined for themselves. Brian wears that gap openly, even when he cannot see it himself, and the show, even at its most critical of him, never stops treating him as worth caring about. But caring about someone and being honest about what they are not the same thing. Brian Griffin is the most honest accident in Family Guy's history, a character who started as a flattering self-portrait and turned, episode by episode, into something that told the truth about what that self-portrait was actually concealing. The voice coming out of his mouth is Seth MacFarlane's real voice. The life coming out of his episodes is the life of someone who had every advantage of intelligence and self-awareness and used neither of them to become the person he kept insisting he already was. __quote_2__. The rest of the Griffin house is no cleaner. The next character in it came into the world with a plan to kill his mother and take over everything, and the show spent 15 years trying to convince you that was funny, before it finally had to admit there was something underneath the joke it did not entirely know how to handle. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, the baby who was supposed to die. There is a version of Stewie Griffin that the show wanted you to forget. Not the Stewie most people think of when they think of Family Guy, the clever, funny, sometimes sweet baby baby who goes on road trips with Brian and makes cutting remarks about everyone around him. Not the Stewie who cries when Brian dies, who wants to be loved, who has a teddy bear named Rupert that he treats like a best friend. That version of Stewie is the one the show settled into after it figured out what made him popular. The version the show wanted you to forget is the one from the beginning, the one Seth MacFarlane actually designed. In the original conception of Stewie Griffin, he was a villain, not a cartoon villain in the silly sense, not a character who does bad things and then winks at the camera, a real one. MacFarlane has confirmed in interviews that when designing Stewie, he drew direct inspiration from Alfred Hitchcock films and James Bond movies, specifically the cold, precise, calculating quality of characters who do terrible things with total control and no emotional mess. Stewie was supposed to be that, but in a baby's body. The joke was not that he was cute. The joke was the gap between what he looked like and what he actually was. What he actually was, in those early seasons, was one of the most genuinely dark characters ever put in a mainstream animated show. The plan to kill Lois was not a background detail or a running gag treated as harmless silliness. In the early seasons of Family Guy, it was the engine of Stewie's entire existence. Every episode where Stewie appeared, the matricide plan, his word for wanting to kill his mother, was front and center. He built weapons in his room. He fired ray guns at her. He set traps. He constructed elaborate schemes designed to end her life. And when they failed, he went back to the drawing board and tried again. The show presented all of this without softening it. Stewie wanted his mother dead. He worked toward that goal with the focus and intelligence of someone who genuinely meant it. The documented list of what Stewie did in those early seasons is not short. He trapped a group of toddlers in a secret underground pit because they annoyed him. The episode calls it the Club of Forgotten Children. The toddlers are left there. The show does not show them escaping. The implication, which the show does not pull back from, is that they starved. Stewie did this to children younger than himself because they displeased him, and the episode moves on. He shot and nearly killed Bonnie Swanson, the neighbor, Joe's wife, for the specific reason that she would not stop talking to Lois on the phone. Not because of anything Bonnie did to him, because her phone call was an interruption. He has tortured Brian's family members to force Brian to buy concert tickets. The methods the show depicts are not cartoon light. They are specific and sustained. He has committed what the show itself describes as serial infanticide, the killing of other babies, across multiple episodes in the early run. He built functional weapons, not props, not toys, working technology, ray guns, time machines, mind control devices, explosives. The show treats the intelligence required to build these things as real within its universe. Stewie is not pretending to be a genius. He is one, and he pointed that genius, consistently and deliberately, at killing people. Academic papers written about Stewie as a fictional case study have formally identified his behavior pattern as antisocial personality disorder, a condition defined by aggression, a complete lack of guilt, a pattern of hurting others without remorse, and a total disregard for rules or consequences. Other papers have applied oppositional defiant disorder to his behavior, noting the specific hostility toward authority figures, the vindictiveness, and the sustained pattern of threatening and harmful behavior. These are not casual fan observations. They are structured analyses applying real psychological frameworks to what the show documented across its episodes. The most telling detail about the original Stewie is not what he did. It is what the show did in response. Nothing. For a long time, nothing happened to Stewie as a result of his actions. He shot at Lois and she survived, and no one called the police. He built weapons in his room, and Peter and Lois walked past his door and kept going. He committed violence against other characters, and the show reset at the end of the episode and started fresh. Stewie was the show's first fully consequence-free character, a prototype for what the show would eventually do to Peter Griffin on a much larger scale. He did terrible things, and the world kept turning, and no one made him pay for any of it. The reason for this, from a writing standpoint, is that the show did not know what to do if Stewie succeeded. MacFarlane designed a character whose entire purpose was a goal: kill Lois, take over the world, and built the comedy around the repeated failure to reach that goal. But failure after failure creates a problem. Eventually, the audience stops believing the character is actually dangerous. The threat becomes noise. The plans become ritual. And what was supposed to be dark became, over time, familiar, comfortable even. This is the moment the show made the choice that changed Stewie forever. Somewhere around season 4, the writers started softening him. The matricide plots became less frequent, then occasional, then rare. The weapons were still there, but used less often for their original purpose. The episode Stewie Kills Lois aired in season 6, a two-parter where Stewie apparently succeeds in killing his mother, and the resolution of that storyline is one of the most revealing moments in the show's history. The entire thing turns out to be a computer simulation. It did not happen. Stewie failed again. But this time, the show protected everyone by making the failure retroactive. It was never real. Nothing counted. After that episode, the show committed to a different version of Stewie. The evil genius baby who wanted to destroy his mother became, gradually, a complicated child who wanted to be loved. The relationship with Brian became the center of his character. The vulnerability that had always existed underneath the villainy, Stewie's therapy session with a child psychologist in one episode, where he opens up about being terrified of being ordinary, is one of the most genuinely sad moments the show ever produced, moved to the front. The ambiguity about his identity, which the show had been threading through his character from early on, became more explicit. Stewie became, in short, someone you felt for, and the show that had built him as a genuine threat quietly put that version away and hoped the audience would follow. Most did. The softer Stewie is the one on the merchandise. He is the one in the Halloween costumes and the phone cases and the posters. He is the one people quote. The original Stewie, the one who left children in a pit to die, who shot a pregnant woman because her phone call was inconvenient, who built weapons with the specific intent to commit murder, is not the Stewie that Family Guy sells to the public. But he is the Stewie that Seth MacFarlane designed. And the gap between those two versions of the same character is the most honest thing the show accidentally revealed about the difference between what it wanted to be and what it was willing to sustain. There is something worth understanding about why Stewie wanted to kill Lois in the first place, because the show never gave a clean answer, and the answer it kept implying is stranger than a simple villain motivation. It is not that Lois is cruel to Stewie. She is not, in any documented episode, a bad mother to him in ways that would logically produce a murderous response. She feeds him, holds him, sings to him. The relationship from her side looks, by the standards of this show, relatively functional. What Stewie seems to resent is not cruelty, but control. The fact that she decides what he eats, when he sleeps, what toys he is allowed to play with. The fact that she exists as an authority over him at all. This is, when you hold it plainly, a child's feeling taken to its absolute extreme. Every child has moments of resenting the parent who controls their world. Every child has felt, at some point, that the person in charge of them is standing between them and freedom. Stewie took that feeling and built a weaponized version of it, complete with ray guns and elaborate plots. The show was not making a point about children being dangerous. It was taking something real and ordinary, the resentment a child feels toward the parent who holds all the power, and blowing it up to a size where it could not be ignored. The later Stewie, the one who wants Lois's love and cries when Brian is taken away and opens up in therapy about being scared of being just like everyone else, is not a different character. He is the same character, with the weapons put down and the real thing underneath made visible. The need for love and the rage at the person who controls whether you get it are two sides of the same thing. The show understood this, even if it could not sustain the darker version of it long enough to do something serious with what it knew. What Stewie Griffin is, across his entire documented run, is a portrait of what happens when a child's most extreme and honest feelings are given total freedom. No filter, no social learning, no gradual understanding that other people matter. Just the raw feeling, given genius-level intelligence and a weapons budget, pointed outward at whoever is closest. The show built that portrait carefully and honestly in the early seasons. Then it got scared of what it had made, softened it, sold the softer version on t-shirts, and moved on. The original Stewie is still in those early episodes. He is still the character MacFarlane designed, sitting in those first 3 seasons with his ray gun and his plans and his complete absence of guilt. The show did not erase him. It just stopped looking at him directly. The next member of this family has been looking directly at all of it. At Peter's cruelty, at Meg's destruction, at Brian's self-deception, at Stewie's transformation, from the closest possible distance. She is supposed to be the one keeping everything together. She is supposed to be the sane one, and she is the most dangerous person in the house. Section 5. Lois Griffin, the most dangerous character on the show. The camera loves Lois Griffin. That is not a comment about how she looks, though the show is very deliberate about how she looks. It is a comment about how the show frames her. When Lois is on screen, she is almost always positioned as the reasonable one. The camera finds her in the middle of chaos and lets her be still. She sighs. She corrects. She explains what the right thing to do is, while everyone around her does the wrong thing. She is the adult in the room. She is the one holding everything together. She is, in the language the show uses to present her, the moral center of the Griffin family. The show is lying. Not occasionally, not in isolated episodes that represent the character having a bad day. The documented record of what Lois Griffin has done across the run of Family Guy, pulled from actual episodes, is the record of someone the show protects with framing and tone tone, while the behavior underneath that framing tells a completely different story. Lois is not the moral center of the Griffin family. She is the most carefully concealed member of its dysfunction, and the concealment is so consistent, so built into how the show presents her, that most people who have watched the show for years never stop to look at what was actually on the screen. Start at the beginning. Before the Griffin family existed as the show presents it, Lois never wanted to be a mother. This is not a fan theory or an interpretation. It is stated in the show's own episodes. She and Peter tried to abort Meg. The attempt failed because the doctor who was going to perform the procedure had one arm, and they were too unsettled to go through with it. Meg exists because an abortion did not happen, not because Lois chose to have her. Then, when pregnant with Chris, Lois smoked and drank heavily throughout the pregnancy in a deliberate attempt to cause a miscarriage. This is confirmed in the episode Peter's Daughter, where Lois says it directly. She stopped, not because she changed her mind about wanting Chris, but because she lost her nerve when the moment arrived. Chris exists because Lois chickened out halfway through trying to end the pregnancy. These are the origins of the Griffin children, as the show itself presents them. Meg was an accident that survived an attempted abortion. Chris was an accident that survived a different kind of attempt. The two older Griffin children were unwanted before they were born, and the person who did not want them is the same person the show frames as the caring, responsible parent. Lois also starred in a pornographic film during her college years. This is revealed in the episode And I'm Joyce Kinney. It is not treated as ancient history that she has grown past. It surfaces, causes chaos, and Lois handles the fallout in ways that are less about accountability and more about managing the perception of her. The episode is not the problem. The problem is the pattern it fits into. Lois having a history the show references and then protects her from, over and over, while other characters face ongoing consequences for far less. The sexual behavior documented across Lois's episodes is one of the most consistent threads in her character, and one of the least examined. She has a powerful and frequently expressed appetite for sex that the show sometimes plays as a quirk and sometimes as something more destabilizing. In Go Stewie Go, she seduces and hooks up with a young man who is Meg's boyfriend, her own teenage daughter's boyfriend. The show plays this as comedy. Lois faces no meaningful consequence. Meg's relationship is destroyed. Lois moves on. In Lois Comes Out of Her Shell, she pursues and engages with a young Justin Bieber character. The show again treats this as comedy. No consequence. No reckoning. Just Lois behaving in ways that, applied to any male character on the show, would be treated as the basis for a storyline about how terrible that character is. This double standard has a name. It is called the unfair sex, and TV Tropes, which documents patterns across television, identifies Lois as a textbook example of it. The unfair sex means a female character is allowed to behave in ways that the show frames as funny or understandable, when a male character doing the identical thing would be framed as monstrous. Lois cheating on Peter is treated differently than Peter's behavior toward Lois. Lois assaulting Peter is treated differently than Peter assaulting Lois. The framing protects her from the judgment the content would normally generate. The assault is documented. Lois forces herself on Peter sexually in multiple episodes when he is not in the mood. She does not ask. She does not stop when he resists. She has explicitly stated within the show's canon that she does not believe men can be raped. The show does not challenge this. It does not present her position as something to push back against. It presents it as a character detail, part of who Lois is, and moves on. The crime spree in Customer of the Week, a season 19 episode, is one of the clearest single-episode portraits of who Lois actually is underneath the reasonable adult framing. She does not win Customer of the Week at a coffee shop. This is the thing that sets her off. In response to not being named Customer of the Week, she exposes a barista to peanuts, knowing the barista has a severe allergy, nearly killing them. She runs over someone with a car. She kidnaps a barista and threatens to inject heroin into them. She then kidnaps that barista's roommates and assaults one of them with a toaster. She does all of this because a coffee shop did not give her a small award. This is not a woman having a bad day. This is a portrait of someone with almost no tolerance for not getting what she believes she deserves, who responds to minor slights with violence and escalating criminal behavior. The show treats it as an episode. Lois faces no meaningful consequence. Next week, she is back in the kitchen being the reasonable parent. The prescription drug story is similarly documented. Brian is prescribed painkillers after falling downstairs. Lois steals his prescription repeatedly to get high. She is taking medication prescribed to someone else for her own recreational use, without asking, without stopping when it becomes a problem. The show presents this as a Lois episode, her having a struggle, rather than as a story about what it means that the family's moral center is stealing medication from the family dog to get high. Underneath all of these specific specific episodes is a larger pattern that the show never quite names directly. Lois grew up wealthy. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a billionaire. She chose to marry Peter and live a middle-class life in Quahog, and the show sometimes frames this as an admirable choice. She walked away from money for love. But the show also documents what that choice cost her, and how she handles the cost. She had plans. She was going to be on the Olympic diving team. She had a life she imagined for herself that did not involve 3 children in a house in Rhode Island with a man who consistently makes everything harder. She gave that life up. And the person who gave it up is still inside her, occasionally surfacing in episodes where her wildness and recklessness come out, and the family has to manage the consequences. The repression the show builds into Lois is real, and it is there across the documented episodes. She is holding back. She is performing the role of the responsible parent because someone has to, and Peter has made clear he will not. The stability of the Griffin house runs on Lois suppressing the version of herself that smoked through a pregnancy and made pornographic films and seduces teenage boys and goes on crime sprees over Customer of the Week awards. The reasonable Lois that the camera loves is a performance. The other one keeps breaking through. What makes Lois the most dangerous character on the show is not any single terrible thing she does. It is the combination of 2 things that the show holds simultaneously and never directly addresses. The first is that Lois is genuinely capable of real harm. The evidence is in the episodes. She is not a good person doing bad things occasionally under pressure. She is someone who hurts people consistently. Her daughter, her husband, the people around her, and faces almost no lasting consequences because the show's framing keeps resetting her to the reasonable adult position before the audience can fully register what just happened. The second is that Lois is the parent the children are supposed to be able to rely on. She is the one who is not Peter. In a house where Peter is the documented chaos, Lois is supposed to be the counterweight. She is supposed to be the parent who notices when things go wrong, who steps in, who protects. And the show has documented, across hundreds of episodes, that she does not do this. She watched Meg get destroyed for 20 years and did not intervene in any meaningful way. She stood between Peter and accountability, repeatedly, because the family's functioning depended on the system staying intact. She enabled the damage, because stopping it would have required her to be something the show would not let her be. The cruelest thing the show ever did with Lois is not a single episode. It is the sustained decision to present someone this compromised as the responsible parent, so consistently and so convincingly that the audience accepted the framing without looking at what was underneath it. There is a brain tumor that the show references in the episode Petarded. It is caused, the show suggests, by Lois repressing the reality of being married to Peter. The show plays this as a joke, but the image it uses, the responsible adult developing a physical condition from the effort of holding everything in, is probably the most honest moment the show ever gave Lois. She is sick from the suppression. The cost of performing reasonableness in that house is a brain tumor, and even that the show turns into a punchline before putting Lois back in the kitchen, where she always returns. Most people who have watched Family Guy for years carry an image of Lois as the normal one, the one the show trusts. The camera built that image carefully, episode after episode, through framing and tone and the contrast with Peter's chaos. The camera was doing something the show was not quite willing to do out loud. Quote, _for, __. The next character on this street has a completely different problem. He has been watching everything in that house from next door for 25 years, and his response to what he has seen is not concern, it is a catchphrase. And the catchphrase has been covering something the show eventually had to stop pretending was just a joke. Section 6, Quagmire, what the show was willing to celebrate. There is a word that has followed Glenn Quagmire for the entire run of Family Guy: giggity. It is his catchphrase. It is on the merchandise. It is on the key rings and the t-shirts and the coffee mugs. When people who have never watched a full episode of Family Guy think of Quagmire, they think of that word. It has become one of the most recognized catchphrases in the history of American animated television. A shorthand for a specific kind of humor, the winking, nudging, boys will be boys energy that the show built around its most openly sexual character. The word exists to make you laugh before you think about what you are laughing at. Because what you are laughing at, when you pull the catchphrase away and look at the documented record of who Glenn Quagmire actually is across the run of Family Guy, is not a lovable rogue with an overactive appetite. It is something the show's own creator has described, in his own words, as an appalling human being. Seth MacFarlane, who voices Quagmire, said that directly in an interview. He called Quagmire appalling. He said the character is someone stuck in the Rat Pack era, a man operating by the rules of a decade-long past, rules that were never acceptable even when they were treated as normal. MacFarlane built this character. He voiced voices him, he called him appalling. And then the show ran the character for 25 plus seasons, put his face on merchandise, and kept the laugh track running. The documented record of what Quagmire has done across the show's episodes is not ambiguous. It does not require interpretation or reading between lines. The show states most of it plainly in episodes that aired on network television, and then frames the statements as jokes and moves on before the weight of what was just said can fully land. He is a rapist. This is not a fan label applied after the fact. Peter Griffin calls Quagmire a rapist directly, in dialogue, in an episode of The Cleveland Show. The show does not treat this as an accusation. It treats it as a description. Multiple episodes in the main Family Guy run feature Quagmire having sex with women who are unconscious. The show frames these moments as gags, quick cuts, a reaction shot, a laugh. But the content is what it is. A man is having sex with women who cannot consent because they are not awake. The show put this on television, repeatedly, across multiple seasons, and called it comedy. The Wikipedia entry for Quagmire, drawing entirely from documented episodes, lists his sexual interests as including somnophilia, being aroused by people who are unconscious or asleep, alongside necrophilia, which is attraction to the dead. The necrophilia is referenced in a cut from the episode Airport 07, which Fox censored from the aired version, but kept on the DVD release. The cut implies Quagmire had sex with a dead woman at her funeral. The show made this content. McFarlane commented on the censorship in the DVD commentary, expressing frustration that it was cut. The content he was frustrated about losing was a joke about a man having sex with a corpse. He is also a human trafficker. Airport 07 is the same episode where his trafficking is established in the show's canon. He traffics women from Asian countries for sex. The show presents this as a background detail of who Quagmire is, part of the larger picture of his past, and does not return to it with any moral weight. It is one item in a list, delivered with the same tone as everything else. The backstory the show eventually gave Quagmire is one of the most uncomfortable elements of the entire character, because it is clearly meant to explain him and does not come close to excusing him. The show appears aware of both of these things, without fully engaging with either. In the episode The Stewaway, Quagmire references an early life experience at a very young age involving an adult in his home. He was 6. The show presents this as a throwaway revelation, a quick line delivered with the same rhythm as a punchline, and the laugh track responds accordingly. But the underlying content is an adult character describing a serious and inappropriate early life situation that, the show suggests, shaped much of what followed. In Quagmire's Mom, it is revealed that his mother had a deeply inappropriate and boundary-violating dynamic with him throughout his formative years. The episode implies, without fully stating, that the situation extended well beyond what would be considered acceptable. The show again presents this in a frame that blunts the impact. Comedy timing, quick cuts, the rhythm of a gag rather than something serious. But the implication is in the episode. It remains part of the canon. His early life is described as involving significant boundary issues within a close family setting at a very young age. These elements are presented as part of the documented foundation of who Glenn Quagmire became. The show places them in the background and then continues to rely on the same recurring humor for years afterward. The episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, stands out as one of the most tonally unusual installments the show produced, because it is one of the few times it engages with a serious subject connected to Quagmire's world and attempts to treat it with a more direct tone. Quagmire's sister Brenda is in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff. The episode follows the abuse, shows its impact, and takes it seriously in ways Family Guy almost never does. Quagmire, in this episode, is protective and loving and genuinely trying to save someone he cares about. The episode ends with Quagmire and Peter murdering Jeff to stop the abuse. The show does not frame the murder as a problem. It frames it as a resolution. Quagmire killed a man to protect his sister, and the camera approves. This is the same character who has, in other documented episodes, drugged women, had sex with unconscious people, trafficked women for sex, and been implied to have engaged with the dead. The show gives him a heroic episode and then puts him back on the shelf with his catchphrase intact. This tonal whiplash is not accidental. It is the show trying to have two things at once: a character it can use for dark comedy about sexual predation, and a character it can occasionally humanize when it wants the audience to feel something. The problem is that both versions are in the same canon. The Quagmire who loves his sister and the Quagmire who traffics women from other countries are the same person in the same show, and the show never figured out what to do with that except keep them in separate episodes. The Me Too reckoning arrived in season 17. Family Guy's producers sat in interviews at San Diego Comic-Con and confirmed that the show was going to take on the cultural conversation about sexual assault and harassment directly, through Quagmire. Seth MacFarlane specifically encouraged loved this, according to the producers who spoke publicly about it. The episode that resulted showed Quagmire facing professional consequences for his behavior, losing his job, being called out publicly, being forced to examine what he does. The episode received mixed responses. Some felt it humanized Quagmire more than it examined him. Some felt it was a genuine attempt to reckon with what the show had built. What is not arguable is the timeline. Family Guy ran Quagmire as an unchallenged joke for 16 seasons before the culture outside the show made the conversation impossible to avoid. The giggity was funny for 16 years, and then the world changed, and the show had to write an episode addressing the fact that what it had been calling funny was something else. Peter Griffin, in that post-Me Too period, delivers a line to Quagmire directly. He says, "Quagmire, you are a rapist." Not as an accusation being disputed, as a statement of established fact between two people who have known each other for decades. The show, by having Peter say this, acknowledged out loud what the documented episodes had been showing since the beginning. Quagmire is a rapist. The show built a rapist, gave him a catchphrase, put him on merchandise, and called it comedy for 16 years before one of his best friends said the word out loud.
There is one more piece of this that the show put in the record and then moved past quickly.
In Quagmire's Baby, he discovers he has a daughter. Her name is Anna Lee. He cannot take care of her and puts her up for adoption. The episode ends on what is meant to be a warm note, Quagmire seeing his daughter happy with her new family and accepting that he made the right choice. And then, in the final beat of the episode, Quagmire says that he can look her up when she turns 18. The implication is sexual. The show makes it sexual. He is talking about his own daughter. The laugh track runs. The episode ends. That moment is in the canon. It aired on television. It is part of the documented record of who the show decided Quagmire was. And the show put it at the end of an episode that was otherwise trying to show Quagmire in a sympathetic light, a man making a hard but loving choice for his child. The final joke undercuts the entire emotional arc the episode built.
And the thing it undercuts it with is a suggestion that Quagmire is sexually interested in his own daughter.
Family Guy did not stumble into Quagmire by accident. McFarlane designed him deliberately, based on a specific archetype, the 1950s party animal, the Rat Pack man, the guy who sees women as targets and conquest as the point. He said this in interviews. He called the character appalling. He kept making the character for 25 years, kept the giggity on the merchandise, kept the laugh track running over content that the show's own creator described as appalling. The question that the Quagmire story raises is not whether the show knew what it was doing. It clearly did. The question is what it means that the show kept doing it anyway, for so long, with such confidence that the audience would keep laughing along. And what it means that, for most of that run, the audience did. The catchphrase was always a choice. Giggity was always covering something. The show knew it.
McFarlane knew it. And for 16 seasons, the laugh track was loud enough that most people watching did not stop to look at what the word was sitting on top of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next character on this street has been in plain sight for the entire run of the show, doing something far more openly terrible than anything Quagmire has done. And the show did not try to hide it. It did not give him a catchphrase to soften the edges. It put what he was directly on screen, in broad daylight, episode after episode. And the audience liked him anyway. That fact is more disturbing than anything Quagmire ever did. Section 7. Herbert, the character nobody was supposed to like. There is a moment in the episode Play It Again, Brian, where Peter and Lois Griffin need someone to watch their children. They call Herbert, not because they do not know who Herbert is, not because the show has been hiding what Herbert is from the audience. By this point in the series, every person watching the show knows exactly what Herbert does and exactly why he wants to be around children. The joke, if it can be called that, is not that Peter and Lois are unaware. The joke is that they called him anyway, that they handed their children to the man who lives down the street and spends every episode trying to get their son alone. And the show frames this as something you laugh at rather than something you sit with. Herbert arrives at the Griffin house excited. He sings. The song he sings is All I Need Is the Girl, a Broadway love song, modified in his version to be about Chris. He is singing a love song about a teenage boy while preparing to babysit that boy. The show plays this with full musical commitment. The animation, the voice performance, the framing of the scene. It is shot and presented the way a funny musical moment in an animated show gets staged. And what is happening inside that moment is a man expressing deeply inappropriate interest toward a child he is about to be left alone with. That is what Family Guy put on television. That is what it framed as comedy. John Herbert was created by Mike Henry, a
a writer and voice actor who joined Family Guy after Seth MacFarlane met his brother at the Rhode Island School of Design. Henry was invited to write and create characters for the show, and Herbert was one of his earliest creations. The character was not always defined this way. In the original concept, Herbert was going to be a creepy school bus driver that Chris was afraid to go near. Unsettling in a general sense, but without the specific and troubling focus that defines the character as he ended up on screen. Henry later introduced that angle to the writers as a pitch. The writers said yes.
The decision to make Herbert a character defined by inappropriate behavior toward minors was a deliberate creative choice made in a writer's room, approved by the people running the show, and then executed across dozens of episodes over more than 20 seasons. Mike Henry based Herbert's voice on a real person, an elderly man he worked with at a grocery store in high school. Henry has described this man in interviews as sweet and kind. The voice he took from that gentle and kind individual was then applied to a character whose documented behavior includes following a child, attempting to lure minors into his house through deceptive means, keeping highly inappropriate material hidden in his home, and expressing ongoing inappropriate interest toward an underage teenage boy across the entire run of the show. Herbert first appeared in season 3, in the episode To Love and Die in Dixie. Chris takes on a paper route and delivers to Herbert's house. Herbert tries to get Chris to come inside. He offers a popsicle. The framing is immediately clear. This is not a friendly old man who wants company. This is someone whose interest in the paperboy is specific and predatory. When the Griffins leave Quahog for a period during this episode, Herbert calls their house 113 times. All 113 messages are about Chris. Where is Chris? When is Chris coming back? The show presents this as a punchline. 113 phone calls from a man who wants to get a teenage boy alone, played as comedy. The pattern that follows across the next 20-plus seasons is one of the most consistently documented predatory behaviors in the history of mainstream animated television, presented entirely within a comedic frame. Herbert buys an ice cream truck. The show establishes in And Then There Were Fewer that he has previously used the ice cream truck to lure children. This is not implied. The episode states it. He uses a vehicle associated with bringing joy to children as a tool to bring children to him. He drives it through the neighborhood. The show presents this as background information about who Herbert is, delivered the same way the show delivers any other piece of character backstory. In the courtship of Stewie's father, Chris breaks Herbert's window by accident. Herbert uses this as leverage to get Peter to send Chris to work off the debt at Herbert's house. Chris comes to Herbert's house and does chores. Herbert invites him to stay for dinner. During the episode, Herbert has a fantasy sequence where he imagines being a woman married to Chris, and the two of them have children together, a son who looks like Chris and a daughter who looks like Herbert. The show animates this fantasy in full. It puts Herbert's romantic and sexual desire for Chris on screen in detailed visual form. And then the episode continues. In moving out Brian's song, Chris gets a job and stops doing his paper route. Stewie takes over the route. Herbert notices the new paperboy and attempts to redirect his attention to Stewie. Stewie, who unlike Chris is actually aware of what Herbert is and what he wants, tells him directly to go away and calls him a perverted old freak. Herbert takes this as encouragement rather than rejection and continues pursuing Stewie with the same methods he uses on Chris. The episode Hannah Banana includes a surveillance video, played back at high speed, of Herbert sneaking into Chris's room at night to paint his portrait. He enters the home of a sleeping teenage boy, in the dark, without anyone's knowledge or permission, to paint him while he sleeps. The show animates this. It plays the surveillance footage back as a comedic reveal. In And Then There Were Fewer, during a scene where everyone is panicked about a power outage and a potential murder, Herbert takes the opportunity to make a comment to Chris, telling him to keep his pants off. This is in the middle of what is supposed to be the show's serious murder mystery episode. Herbert's predation is so thoroughly normalized by this point in the show's run that it can be dropped into any scene, in any episode, in any context, and the show treats it as consistent background behavior rather than something that should stop the scene entirely. The episode that makes the full picture clearest is Play It Again Brian, the babysitting episode. Herbert arrives to watch Chris, Stewie, and Meg. He makes clear that he has no interest in Meg because she is a girl and because of her age, the show having him specify that she is too old, which sets a floor for what age he is interested in. He attempts to get Chris to bathe him. He attempts multiple other forms of physical access to Chris throughout the episode. He reads Chris a bedtime story, Peter and the Wolf, and changes the moral of the story to match his own desires. And then Chris, lying in bed, looks at Herbert and asks him directly if he is someone who has inappropriate interests in minors. Herbert's answer is not shown, the camera cuts away, the show does not let Herbert respond on screen. This is one of the most revealing editorial choices in the character's entire run because it signals exactly what the show understood it was doing. If Herbert denies it,
the show has him misleading a child about something the audience is clearly meant to recognize. If Herbert confirms it, the show would be depicting an adult openly acknowledging deeply inappropriate intentions toward a teenage boy while supervising him. Neither version is something the show was willing to fully commit to on screen, so it cuts away. It lets the question hang in the air and moves on. The presence of highly inappropriate material is part of the canon. In And Then There Were Fewer, Herbert tells Chris directly that if he dies, Chris should burn his house down. The reason he gives is to prevent the discovery of what is inside. The episode makes clear what is being implied.
Herbert has told a teenager to destroy evidence of his crimes against children as a posthumous favor. The show delivers this as a piece of dialogue, and the scene continues. The critical reception of Herbert has always been divided, and the division is itself revealing. IGN ranked him 16th on their list of the top 25 Family Guy characters. He appears on merchandise. He has a devoted fan base. He made crossover appearances in The Cleveland Show, the Family Guy spin-off, where he has also played for laughs in the same way. He has appeared in Star Wars parody episodes as Obi-Wan Kenobi. He is, by any measure of the show's commercial relationship with its characters, a success. The AV Club critic, Rowan Kaiser, wrote about Herbert in terms that are worth sitting with. He described the character as a black hole of badness, whose every appearance brings out the worst tendencies of Family Guy, and said that Herbert brings every episode he appears in to a complete stop. This is a minority critical position. Most coverage of Herbert treats him the way the show treats him, as a recurring comedy character with a specific joke that the show keeps returning to. But Kaiser's response names something real. There is a way of watching Herbert's episodes where the comedic framing stops working, and what remains is just the underlying content. An adult with deeply inappropriate intentions toward a child being repeatedly placed in close proximity to that child, episode after episode, while the laugh track continues. The show itself, in the episode Spies Reminiscent of Us, has Stewie say something that lands differently when you have been watching Herbert for a while. Stewie refers to Herbert as the pedophile who lives down the street about whom no one is taking any action because he is so funny. This line is Family Guy talking to itself. It is the show acknowledging, through one of its characters, that everyone knows what Herbert is, and everyone is letting it continue because the character makes people laugh. The show is describing its own decision-making process through a piece of dialogue, and then it keeps making the same decision. Merchandise exists. There are Herbert keyrings. There are Herbert figurines. The first wave of Family Guy toy figures, released in 2004, included Herbert alongside the Griffin family. A toy depicting a documented pedophile, sold alongside children's animated show merchandise, produced and distributed because the character was popular enough to justify it. That popularity is the most uncomfortable fact in the entire Herbert story. Not what he does in the episodes, not the babysitting scene or the surveillance video or the child pornography or the 113 phone calls. The most uncomfortable fact is that audiences watched all of it and liked him anyway. They put him on their lists of favorite characters. They bought the keyring. They quoted him. They welcomed his appearances and watched him go after Chris and kept laughing. The show did not trick anyone into this response. It was not subtle about what Herbert was. It stated it clearly, episode after episode, in plain language and plain images. The audience chose to find it funny. That choice belongs to the audience, not just the show. And what that choice reveals about the distance between what people will laugh at when it is wrapped in animation and a laugh track, and what those same people would never tolerate if presented plainly, is the question that Herbert's entire existence raises, and that neither the show nor the audience has ever fully answered. The character nobody was supposed to like became one of the most recognizable faces on Family Guy, and the show let it happen because the laugh track was running and the numbers were good, and no one stopped to sit with what they were actually watching. __6___. There is a boy in that neighborhood who has been the target of Herbert's attention since season 3, who considers Herbert a friend, who has no idea what is actually happening, who is living in a house with parents who called that man to babysit him. That boy has his own story, and his story is the one the show forgot to tell because it was too busy using him as a setup for other people's jokes. Section 8. Chris Griffin, the son the show forgot to write. There is a running gag in Family Guy that lasts for 6 full seasons. An evil monkey lives in Chris Griffin's closet. Every time Chris opens the closet door, the monkey is there. It points at him. It makes a threatening face. Chris screams. The gag repeats. Episode after episode, season after season, a teenage boy is being terrorized in his own bedroom by something that lives in his closet, and nobody in the house does anything about it. Peter does not check the closet. Lois does not investigate. The monkey is simply there there, pointing at Chris, and the family moves around this fact the same way they move around everything else in that house, by not looking at it directly and continuing with whatever they were already doing. The evil monkey gag is played entirely for laughs.
It is one of the show's most recognizable running jokes, and when you hold it next to everything else documented about Chris Griffin's life in that house, it stops being just a joke and starts being an accidental portrait of something the show never meant to say out loud. Nobody in the Griffin family is paying attention to Chris. Christopher Cross Griffin is the middle child of Peter and Lois. He is 13 when the show begins, aging inconsistently across the run the way Family Guy ages all its characters, sometimes referenced as older, sometimes reset back, never landing on a firm number the show commits to. He is voiced by Seth Green, who was not hired until after the original pilot, where MacFarlane voiced Chris himself with a deeper tone. He is overweight, not particularly academic, interested in drawing and comic books and baseball and Mexican food. He has a good heart. He is, by the assessment of multiple episodes that bother to look at him carefully, probably the least corrupted person in the Griffin house. The show has almost no idea what to do with him. This is not an interpretation. It is visible in how the episodes are structured. When Family Guy needs a story, it reaches for Peter, or Brian, or Stewie, or occasionally Meg. Chris appears in episodes but rarely drives them. He is present in family scenes but rarely the reason for them. He has storylines that begin and then quietly disappear without resolution. He has relationships that the show introduces and forgets. He exists in the Griffin family the way middle children in real dysfunctional families sometimes exist. Present enough that no one worries, invisible enough that no one looks closely. The circumstances of his existence were set before he was born, and they are worth stating plainly because the show itself stated them and then moved on as if they did not matter.
Chris was conceived by accident.
This is confirmed in the episode Mission Impossible, which establishes that both Meg and Chris came from broken condoms. His conception was not planned or wanted. When Lois became pregnant with Chris, she did not simply accept the pregnancy and move forward. The episode Peter's Daughter confirms that she smoked and drank heavily throughout the pregnancy in a deliberate attempt to cause a miscarriage. She wanted to end the pregnancy and chose methods she believed might accomplish that. She stopped not because she changed her mind about wanting Chris, but because she lost her nerve when the actual moment arrived. Chris was born because his mother ran out of courage to go through with ending the pregnancy, not because she wanted him to exist. The show puts this information in the record and then treats Chris as a normal kid in subsequent episodes. It does not explore what it means that this is how he came into the world. It does not ask what it would mean for a child to know this, or to grow up in a house where this is part of the family's history. It drops the information and moves on. Chris moves on too, because Chris does not know. He is living in a house full of things he does not know. The thing he most famously does not know is what Herbert wants from him. The entire Herbert situation, documented across 6+ seasons, is framed from the audience's perspective. Everyone watching knows what Herbert is and what he is trying to do, but Chris does not know. Chris, in documented episodes, considers Herbert a friend. He goes to Herbert's house to do chores. He stays for dinner. He accepts the popsicles. When Herbert reads him bedtime stories and modifies the morals of those stories to suit his own desires, Chris listens. He is a teenager being slowly groomed by a predatory adult, and the show presents his unawareness as the comedy. This is the thing that needs to be held still for a moment, because it is easy to let the comedy framing carry you past it. Chris Griffin is a child. He does not have the experience or the awareness to understand what Herbert is doing. He cannot read the signals that are obvious to every adult watching the show. He is trusting someone the show has established is dangerous, and the people responsible for protecting him, his parents, who in Play It Again Brian actively hired Herbert to babysit him, are either unaware or unbothered. The comedy depends entirely on the audience knowing something Chris does not know, and finding it funny that he does not know it. The joke is his vulnerability. The punchline is his unawareness of his own danger. At one point in Play It Again Brian, Chris gets close enough to the truth to ask Herbert directly if he is a pedophile. This is the most aware Chris ever gets on screen about what is happening to him. The show does not let the answer happen. The camera cuts away. Chris asked the right question, and the show could not let him have the answer, because the answer would have ended the gag and forced the show to deal with what it had been building. After that moment, Chris goes back to not knowing. The monkey goes back in the closet. The show moves on. The things Chris is good at are worth naming because the show references them inconsistently and then forgets them, which is itself part of the pattern. He is genuinely skilled at drawing. Multiple episodes establish this and treat it as a real talent rather than a throwaway detail. He has a strong visual sense. He picks up new skills quickly. In the season 4 episode Patriot Games, the family moves to London briefly, and Chris learns to speak in a convincing local accent within days, while everyone else in the family cannot manage it at at all. He is, in moments where the show remembers to look at him, perceptive in ways that catch people off guard. In the academic analysis applying birth order to the Griffins, Chris is identified as exhibiting classic middle child qualities: underestimated, adaptable, skilled at reading situations, starved for the kind of attention that would let those skills develop into something. The show never develops them into something.
There is a through line in Chris's romantic and social life that the show treats as comedy, and that functions, when examined, as a portrait of a teenager who has received no meaningful guidance from the adults around him. His relationship with his mother is depicted across episodes in ways the show consistently frames as jokes, but that register as genuinely unusual and worth examining. In multiple instances, Chris shows a pattern of misplaced and inappropriate interest toward her. In E Peterbus Unum, he passes a note during the period the family runs its own country, describing her in overly admiring terms. In Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, he reacts in a way that suggests blurred boundaries during a conversation she has. In Model Misbehavior, he indicates that he plans to use photos of her in a way that crosses personal boundaries. The show presents all of these moments as quick gags and moves on, but a teenager displaying this kind of repeated boundary confusion toward a parent figure across multiple seasons
is not a punchline that exists in isolation. It is a pattern, and the pattern points to a boy who is getting no healthy modeling of relationships, no guidance about attraction or boundaries, no adult in the house paying enough attention to notice that something is wrong. Peter's relationship with Chris is one of disappointed distance dressed up as affection. In The Sun Also Draws, Chris fears he does not live up to Peter's expectations. In He's Too Sexy for His Fat, Peter gets in shape, and Chris, still overweight, feels the gap between himself and his father in ways that are genuinely painful. In Forefather, an earlier episode, Peter gives Chris away because he believes he has failed as a father to him. He gives his son away. He hands Chris to someone else because he has decided, in his usual impulsive and uncommitted way, that the father-son relationship is not working, and abandonment is a reasonable response. The show plays this as a story about Peter, not about what being given away does to the child being handed over. The evil monkey is resolved in the season 8 episode Hannah Banana, when it is revealed that the monkey has a reason for his hostility toward Chris, a misunderstanding involving a banana, and the two of them come to peace. The monkey moves out of Chris's closet and goes to terrorize Jake Tucker instead. This is played as a warm resolution, a years-long storyline coming to a close, and the resolution itself is revealing. The thing that was terrorizing Chris in his own room was not evil. It was reacting to something Chris did without understanding the consequences. The monster in the closet was just someone with a grievance that never got addressed because nobody in that house was paying enough attention to ask why it was there. That is Chris Griffin's story in miniature. Not a child surrounded by evil. A child surrounded by people who are too focused on themselves to pay attention to what is happening to him. A predator moves next door and gets access to him because the adults are not looking. A creature lives in his closet for 6 years because nobody checks. His mother tries to end his pregnancy. His conception is accidental. His father gives him away when parenting gets difficult, and the show's primary use for him is as a reaction shot in other characters' stories. He is a good kid. This is worth saying because the show occasionally remembers it, and the moments where it does are the clearest evidence that someone in the writing room understood what they had failed to do with the character. In documented episodes, Chris shows genuine kindness to people the rest of the family ignores. He forms real friendships. He responds to other people's pain with more awareness than either of his parents regularly demonstrates. He is, in the episodes that bother to look at him, the least damaged person in that house, which is extraordinary given what the house has exposed him to. The show did not build that goodness into anything. It did not follow it. It did not ask what kind of person Chris might become if anyone in that family paid attention to who he was, rather than using him as background presence in their own stories. It kept him in the middle, present but not central, visible but not seen. The evil monkey lived in his closet for 6 seasons. Nobody checked. That is the Chris Griffin story. A boy in a broken house, surrounded by people too lost in themselves to protect him, who stayed good anyway without anyone noticing or rewarding it. The show used him when it needed him and forgot him when it did not.
And called the forgetting normal because it happened to everyone in that family in different ways. __quote_7___. The Griffin house has one more secret that the show has been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning. It is not about any single character's behavior. It is about where the money comes from, who controls it, and what that control has done to every person in that house for 25 years. The most powerful person connected to this family has barely been discussed, and he is the one the show uses to say the things it is
never quite willing to say directly.
Section 9. Carter Pewterschmidt,
The show's actual villain. There is a character in Family Guy who has owned slaves. Not in a cutaway gag set in a different time period, not in a dream sequence or a fantasy or a historical parody. In the actual, documented history of the Griffin family's world, Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, the billionaire patriarch of the Pewterschmidt family, has owned people. The show references this as part of who he is. It is in the record. And then the show moves on, because Carter moves on, because Carter has always moved on from the things he has done. And the moving on is the whole point of his character. Carter Pewterschmidt is the most powerful person connected to the Griffin family. He is also, by the documented record of his behavior across the show's run, the person who has caused the most sustained damage to the most people with the least consequence attached to any of it. He is not the character people talk about when they talk about Family Guy's darkness. He is not on the merchandise the way Quagmire is, not analyzed the way Brian is, not debated the way Peter is. He exists in the background of the show's world, controlling enormous amounts of money and power, and the show uses him when it needs to say something about wealth and cruelty that it cannot quite say through the main cast. What it says, across the documented episodes, is something the show never pulls together into a single clean statement, but that is visible in the pattern of what Carter does and what happens to him as a result. Nothing happens to him, ever. That is the statement. Carter Pewterschmidt is voiced by Seth MacFarlane, the same man who voices Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire. This means that in any scene where Carter interacts with those characters, MacFarlane is essentially talking to himself, performing multiple sides of a conversation between a man of enormous wealth and the people his wealth affects. Whether this was a deliberate choice about how to represent the relationship between power and the people beneath it, or just a practical casting decision, the effect is the same. Carter's voice is the same voice that comes out of the other characters, slightly adjusted, which makes him feel like a version of the same person operating at a different level of the social order. The documented history of Carter's racism runs through the show from his early appearances. He is established in multiple episodes as holding views about race that the show does not dress up or soften. He makes statements that are openly racist toward black people, toward Jewish people, toward people from other countries. He has expressed these views in front of his family, in front of Peter, in episodes where the show makes clear that these are not casual slips, but settled beliefs that Carter has held his entire life and sees no reason to examine. The show presents these moments in its usual frame: quick delivery, comedy timing, the scene moves on, but the content is not ambiguous. Carter Pewterschmidt is a racist. It is in the canon. The slavery reference fits into a larger picture of how Carter acquired and maintained his wealth. The show establishes, across episodes, that the Pewterschmidt fortune was not built cleanly. Carter has done things to accumulate the money that the show acknowledges without exploring. He has treated people as resources rather than as people. He has used his financial position to insulate himself from the consequences of his behavior in ways that characters with less money cannot manage. The slavery is the most extreme example the show puts in the record, but it is consistent with the overall portrait of a man who has spent his life taking what he wanted from whoever had it and using his wealth to ensure that the taking never caught up with him. His relationship with Peter is one of the most honest things Family Guy does about class, about what it actually looks like when someone from old money has to deal with someone who is working class and not particularly impressive by any conventional measure. Carter does not hide his contempt for Peter. He never has. He thinks Peter is beneath Lois. He thinks Peter was a bad choice. He thinks the Griffin's house and the Griffin's life represent a failure of ambition that reflects poorly on everyone involved. He says this in various forms across multiple episodes. He is openly dismissive of Peter in ways that Peter sometimes registers and sometimes does not. And the show plays the contempt as comedy because putting it in a comedy frame is the only way to present it without the audience having to fully reckon with what is being shown. What is being shown is a wealthy man treating a working class man as fundamentally inferior and less worthy of basic respect in front of that man's wife and children, and facing no consequence for it because the wealthy man controls the money and the money controls the situation. Carter cuts Lois off financially when she makes choices he disapproves of. This is documented in multiple episodes. When Lois does something Carter does not want her to do, the financial support stops. When Lois goes against his wishes, the money disappears. This is not a minor detail about the Pewterschmidt family dynamic. It is a documented pattern of using financial control as a tool to direct the behavior of a grown adult woman. Carter controls his daughter through money. He always has. And the show presents this as background information about their relationship, a quirk of the wealthy father dynamic, rather than as the sustained emotional manipulation that it functionally is. The Griffin family lives in their house in Quahog partly because of Carter's money, and the various ways it enters and exits their lives, depending on his mood and approval. The stability of the household that the show presents as normal is conditional on Carter's satisfaction with the people in it. When Carter is happy, resources flow. When Carter is not happy, resources stop. Everyone in the Griffin family, consciously or not, is operating within a system that Carter controls. Peter's jobs, the house, the family's ability to sustain the lifestyle the show depicts, all of it exists in relationship to Carter's wealth and Carter's decisions about who deserves access to it. The episode that makes Carter's power most explicit is not a single dramatic confrontation, but a pattern across multiple episodes where Carter simply decides what is going to happen, and the world around him rearranges itself accordingly. He buys things, he removes things, he makes problems disappear when the problems affect him, and lets problems continue when they affect other people. He is the most functional expression of how money actually works in the world of Family Guy. Not as a neutral tool, but as a force that determines whose behavior has consequences and whose does not. Carter has been shown in episodes doing things that would, for any other character on the show, generate lasting storylines about accountability. He has manipulated people. He has used his financial position to interfere in other people's lives in ways that caused real damage. He has held views and acted on views that the show frames as terrible when they come from less powerful characters. And he has walked away from all of it because walking away is what wealth allows you to do. Peter Griffin gets into trouble when he does terrible things. Not always meaningful trouble, especially in later seasons, but the show at least gestures at his behavior having weight. Brian Griffin gets called out in famous and specific dialogue for the gap between who he says he is and what he does. Quagmire gets a Me Too episode. Meg's abuse is acknowledged in a full episode that names what it is. Carter Pewterschmidt does not get an episode that names what he is. He does not get a Quagmire speech. He does not get a seahorse seashell party moment where someone sits across from him and says the things that need to be said. He just keeps going. Episode after episode, season after season, the richest person connected to the Griffin family keeps doing what rich people do in Family Guy's world, which is whatever they want for whatever reason, with no one positioned to stop them. This is where Carter becomes the most honest character the show has ever produced, even though the show did not intend it as honesty. It intended him as a recurring antagonist with comedic potential, but what it built across the documented episodes is a portrait of how power actually functions. Not the cartoon version where power is dramatic and evil and announces itself. The real version, where power is quiet and ordinary and operates through money and social position and the slow pressure of who controls the resources that everyone else needs to survive. Carter does not need to be dramatic. He does not need to make speeches or fight or threaten in obvious ways. He just needs to control the money. The money does everything else. It determines who gets to stay in the house and who gets cut off. It determines whose behavior gets examined and whose gets ignored. It determines who the show can afford to hold accountable and who it cannot. Because holding Carter accountable would mean engaging with what his wealth represents in a way the show has never been willing to do. There is a version of Family Guy where Carter Pewterschmidt is the central figure, where the show follows the money and asks what the Pewterschmidt fortune has actually cost the people who were not born into it. That version of the show would look very different from what Family Guy actually is. It would be harder. It would be angrier. It would have things to say about class and inheritance and the way old money shapes the lives of everyone it touches that a comedy about a bumbling dad in Rhode Island cannot quite get to. Family Guy is not that show, but Carter is that show's shadow, visible in the background of the Griffin family's world, controlling more than he has ever shown to control, getting away with more than he has ever shown to get away with. Because the show understood, probably without ever articulating it clearly, that the most honest thing it could do with a billionaire character was to make him consequence-free. Rich people do not face consequences on Family Guy. Carter is the proof. Every other character in this essay has had at least one moment where the show acknowledged what they were. Carter has not had that moment. He has had comedy. He has had recurring appearances. He has had scenes where other characters react to his behavior with frustration or shock. But he has not had the episode where someone sits across from him and says what needs to be said, because the show knows, at some level, that the person with the most money is also the person that the world is least designed to hold still for that conversation. The Pewterschmidt money runs under everything in the Griffin family's story. It is the current beneath the surface of every episode, rarely named, always present. Carter is the source of that current. And the show's decision to keep him in the background, powerful and comfortable and largely unexamined, is the most honest thing it ever accidentally said about how the world outside of Quahog actually works. Every character in this essay has a problem the show eventually named, even if it did not fix it. Peter's cruelty, Meg's abuse, Brian's self-deception, Stewie's darkness, Lois's hidden damage, Quagmire's violence, Herbert's predation, Chris's invisibility, Carter's consequence-free wealth. These are 9 separate portraits, and the show built all of them, and the show aired all of them, and the laugh track ran over all of them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What connects them is something the show has never quite said in a single place.
It has said it in pieces across hundreds of episodes and 25 plus years. Hidden inside jokes and cutaway gags and musical numbers and the quiet moments between the loud ones. It has been saying the same thing this entire time, and the last section of this essay is where that thing finally gets said out loud. Section 10. The Griffin family as a system. What the show was actually documenting. There is an episode of Family Guy that most people remember for the wrong reason. Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10, Episode 2, is usually discussed as the Meg episode, the one where she finally stands up, where she says the things she has never been allowed to say, where she names the abuse and refuses it for one brief stretch of television before taking it all back. People remember the standing up. They remember the speech. They remember Meg, for once, being the one in the room with the most clarity. What most people do not spend as much time with is what happens in the middle of the episode, after Meg speaks and before she apologizes. When Meg refuses to be the lightning rod, the family does not suddenly become healthy. They do not look at themselves and feel the weight of what they have been doing. They turn on each other. Peter and Lois fight in ways that are uglier than their usual fighting. Chris falls apart. The house, without Meg absorbing everything, becomes a place where nothing works and no one can function. The chaos that Meg's suffering had been quietly containing spills out in every direction the moment she stops containing it. This is not played as a revelation that something is deeply wrong with the Griffin family. It is played as evidence that Meg needs to go back to her role. The episode treats the family's collapse as a reason for Meg to return to being hurt, rather than as a reason for the family to stop hurting her. It treats the system as more important than the person the system is destroying. That is what the show has been documenting for 25 years. Not a funny family with dark edges. A system. A specific, closed, self-maintaining system where every person plays a role that keeps the whole thing running, and where the system protects itself by making the roles feel natural and necessary, and even, in the cruelest cases, chosen. Researchers who study how troubled families operate have identified a set of roles that tend to appear in families where something is seriously wrong. These roles are not assigned in a meeting or written down anywhere. They develop over time, through habit and need, and the slow pressure of everyone adjusting their behavior to manage the person or the problem at the center. The roles have names. The one who causes the chaos, the one who enables it, the one who disappears into the background, the one who uses humor to release the pressure, and the one who absorbs the damage so everyone else does not have to. The Griffin family fills every single one of these roles, and the show built each of them with enough detail that they hold up against the framework completely, not because the writers were making a deliberate statement about troubled families, but because they were drawing from real human behavior and real family dynamics, and the truth came through whether they intended it or not. Peter is the chaos. This has been true from the beginning, and it has become more true with every season. He is the unpredictable center of the family's world, the person around whom everyone else has to constantly adjust, manage, and protect themselves. His moods determine the household's weather. His decisions drive the plots. His impulsiveness creates the disasters that the rest of the family spends episodes cleaning up or surviving. Everything in the Griffin house is organized, consciously or not, around managing Peter or dealing with the consequences of not managing him successfully. This is the documented pattern across the show's run. Not a funny dad who makes mistakes. The central force of instability around which a family system has built itself. Lois is the enabler, not because she is weak or stupid. The show has established she is neither, but because enabling is the role the system assigned her, and she has held it for 25 years. Enabling does not mean being nice to the person causing the chaos. It means protecting the system that allows the chaos to continue. Lois does this constantly and consistently. She does not hold Peter accountable in lasting ways. She manages the fallout of his behavior rather than stopping the behavior. She presents the family to the outside world as functional when it is not. She watched Meg get destroyed for 2 decades and did not intervene in any meaningful way. Not because she did not see it, but because intervening would have required her to challenge the system, and the system was the thing keeping the family together, or at least keeping it appearing together. Her own darkness, the crime sprees, the substance theft, the sexual behavior, the history she carries, exists inside the same system. She is not separate from it. She is load-bearing. Chris is the lost child. This role belongs to the family member who responds to the chaos by becoming invisible. Not dramatically invisible, not running away or acting out in ways that demand attention, just quietly fading into the background, being present without being seen, surviving by not requiring anything from people who have nothing left to give. Chris does this across the entire run of the show. He is in the house. He is in the scenes. He is available when the plot needs a reaction shot or a quick joke. And then the episode moves on, and Chris fades back into the middle distance where the show keeps him, because the show, like his family,
cannot figure out what to do with him and finds it easier to leave him where he is. Stewie is the most complicated fit in the framework because he changed. In the early seasons, Stewie was something closer to a second chaos agent, a second source of instability operating alongside Peter, but with more intelligence and more specific intent. The show eventually softened him into what researchers call the mascot, the family member who uses humor and performance to release the tension that builds up in a troubled household. The mascot makes people laugh. The mascot diffuses the moments that would otherwise become unbearable. The mascot's function is to keep the emotional temperature of the family from reaching the point where someone would have to deal with what is actually happening. Stewie, in his later seasons, does exactly this. His wit and his antics and his relationship with Brian provide the relief valve that lets the show keep showing you the darkness without the darkness becoming something you cannot laugh at. Meg is the scapegoat. The show said this directly, in those words, in Seahorse Seashell Party. The scapegoat is the family member who absorbs the blame, the anger, the frustration, and the pain that would otherwise have nowhere to go. They become the reason everything is wrong. They become the target that unites everyone else, because when the family is focused on what is wrong with the scapegoat, they are not focused on what is wrong with each other. The scapegoat holds the family together by being the thing the family is held together against. Remove the scapegoat, and the family has to face itself. This is exactly what happens in Seahorse Seashell Party. Meg stops absorbing, and the family immediately starts tearing itself apart. The episode proves the framework, and then uses the proof as justification to put the scapegoat back in place. Brian is the one the framework calls the family hero, though in the Griffins, the hero role is badly distorted. The hero is usually the family member who presents a functional, capable face to the outside world, the one who gets good grades, or holds a job, or looks, from the outside, like the family produced at least one person who has it together. Brian performs this function, in a broken way, by being the character the show uses to gesture at intelligence and awareness and culture. He reads, he writes, he has political opinions. He is supposed to be the one who sees clearly. The distortion is that Brian does not actually see clearly at all. His self-image is as false as anything in the house, and his drinking and his behavior and his absent fatherhood are all documented in the episodes. He presents a functional face while being as damaged as everyone else. He is the family hero who does not actually save anyone, including himself. Carter sits outside the family but controls it, which is its own kind of role, the one the framework does not always name directly because it operates from a distance. He is the source of the resources that the system depends on. He decides, through his money and his approval, which version of the Griffin family gets to exist. When he is satisfied, the family has what it needs. When he is not, the family feels the pressure. Every system has something it is organized around sustaining, and the Griffin family is partly organized around maintaining enough of Carter's approval to keep the financial access that the family's life depends on. This is not stated directly in any single episode. It is visible in the pattern of how Carter's presence affects the family's behavior and decisions across the run of the show. The system has one more quality that the show documented without ever fully examining it, and it is the most important one. It is self-repairing. Every time something happens in the Griffin family that should change the dynamic, every time Meg speaks, every time Brian gets called out, every time Peter faces a consequence that seems like it might stick, the show resets. The next episode begins, and everything is back where it was. Peter is impulsive and cruel and facing no lasting consequences. Meg is the target. Brian is convinced of his own sophistication. Lois is performing stability. Chris is in the background. Stewie is making jokes. Carter is in his mansion with his money. The system reassembles itself, episode after episode, season after season, because the system is what the show is, not a story moving towards something, a system maintaining itself. This is the most honest thing Family Guy ever documented, and it documented it by accident. Real troubled family systems do not change because a single episode of honesty occurs. They do not change because someone says the right thing in the right moment. They change, when they change at all, because the people inside them decide that the cost of the system is higher than the cost of dismantling it. That decision is hard. It is painful. It requires the people who have built their lives around their roles to give up the roles and face what is underneath them. Most troubled family systems do not make that decision. Most of them keep running
running, episode after episode, season after season, with the same people in the same roles, absorbing the same damage, because the system is the only stability anyone inside it has ever known. Family Guy ran for 25 years. The Griffins did not change in any lasting way. The show's own most self-aware episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, ended with the system reasserting itself. Meg went back to being the lightning rod. Peter went back to being the chaos. Lois went back to enabling. Brian went back to pretending. Chris went back to the background. The family that the episode had briefly cracked open closed back up, and the next episode started, and the laugh track ran. The show was not making a statement about this. It was not trying to hold a mirror up to troubled families and say, look at what you are doing. It was trying to make people laugh, which it mostly succeeded at, across a run that made it one of the longest-running animated shows in American television history. But the mirror was there anyway, built into the structure of the family and the roles and the system that the writers drew from real human behavior, whether they meant to or not. You could watch Family Guy for 25 years and see only the jokes. A lot of people did.
Or you could watch it and see the thing underneath the jokes, the closed, self-maintaining, damage-producing system that the show kept presenting as a family, episode after episode, season after season, with a laugh track running over the parts that should have made everyone stop laughing. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that he wished the show had ended earlier. He wanted to stop around season 7, when the characters still had some of the balance that made them worth watching, when the system had not yet consumed everything recognizable about the people inside it. Fox renewed it. The show kept going. The system kept running. The characters kept doing what their roles required them to do, season after season, because that is what systems do when nobody decides the cost is too high. The Griffin family is not a funny family with dark edges. It never was. It is a portrait of what a family looks like when damage gets passed down and roles get locked in, and the system that protects itself becomes more important than the people being protected. The show dressed that portrait in bright colors and a laugh track and cutaway gags and one of the most recognizable theme songs in television history. The colors were always bright. The laugh track always ran. And underneath all of it, in every episode, across every season, the system kept doing what it was built to do. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.